As world leaders meet at the United Nations in New York, the international organization itself is facing mounting criticism 60 years after it was founded, with some even questioning its relevance. Just what does it take for the United Nations to fulfill its mission properly? And could the organization alone solve the world's many problems? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Mariam Namazi. The 64th session of the UN General Assembly, leaders of 192 countries are meeting to address the world's problems. The 7-day annual gathering started on Wednesday. US President Barack Obama, Libya's leader Muammar Gaddafi and Iran's President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad were some of the prominent leaders who addressed the session on day one. Some of the key issues on the agenda include climate change, the Middle East peace process and nuclear disarmament. But a recurrent issue in the General Assembly's meetings in recent years is the UN itself.
If ever there were a time to act in a spirit of renewed multilateralism, a moment to create a United Nations of genuine collective action, it is now. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, now is our time, a time to put the united back into the United Nations. United in purpose, united in action.
Well, some leaders were remarkably vocal in their criticism and their dissatisfaction with the current structure of the United Nations, saying the Charter is outdated.
And you know, I have the Charter, a copy of it, and once you read the Charter of the United Nations, the preamble of the United Nations is different from the provisions and the articles. How this came to existence, those who attended in San Francisco in 1945, they all participated in the preamble, but they left the articles and the provisions and the procedures of the internal procedures of the Security Council, or the so-called Security Councils. They left it to the job of the experts and the countries who are interested, which are the countries who created the Security Councils, which countries came together united against Germany. The preamble is very tempting, and no one is objecting to the preamble. But everything that came after that is completely in contradictions with the preamble. This is what we have now. This is what we are rejecting, and we shall never continue with it. This came to an end during the Second World War.
Other leaders, though, were staunch advocates of the status quo.
I stand here to reaffirm the United Nations Charter, not to tear it up. I call on every nation to support its universal principles.
And joining us today are our guests. At the UN in New York, we have Ahmed Fawzi, former deputy spokesperson for Boutros Ghali and current director of news and media at the UN. In Geneva, Yash Tandon, former executive director of the South Center. And in Washington, D.C., Ruth Wedgwood, professor of international law and diplomacy at John Hopkins University and former U.S. member of the United Nations Human Rights Committee. Mr. Fawzi, if I can come to you first, is the UN still relevant?
Absolutely, and I believe that the majority of member states will tell you that it is. It's the only global forum we have that is able to convene such a large gathering of member states at such a high level and at all levels in order to assess, discuss and find solutions to global problems. If the United Nations did not exist, we would have to invent it.
Ruth Wedgwood, major issues on the agenda of the UN General Assembly this week, including climate change, nuclear energy, and indeed the global economic crisis. The common thread holding it all together seems to be this idea that, as Mr. Fawzi says, that member states have a duty, a responsibility to tackle these problems. But beyond the talking and the debate, will we see any tangible progress, tangible results?
Well, there's relatively little done in the opening of a General Assembly. It's more titular. I mean, there is an economy of scale in the UN where it's a very convenient place for heads of state to get together, particularly for small countries that don't have missions all over the world. It's also a place for posturing, if you will, with Ahmadinejad and Gaddafi, so that at times the bombast can detract from the seriousness of the shared problems. But I do think that there's much to be said for my colleague who remarked that you really do need a place to get together to try to have quiet conversations when perhaps you otherwise can't be seen with one another. And at times, once in a while, there's a kind of doctrinal, philosophical breakthrough. If you don't expect too much of the UN, you're more likely to walk away satisfied.
Yash Tandon, what's your view on all this? Just how relevant are these discussions at the end of the day?
Well, in the absence of anything else, we have to do what we have. We have the United Nations, and we must make best use of it. But there is no question that the UN has, or certain organs of the United Nations have become illegitimate. I would say that the Security Council has lost its coherence with reality. It's no longer able to reflect either the power or the demographic reality of the world. So, so the shift of power must pass on from Security Council to the General Assembly, which is more representative. And even if there are people who as Professor Wedgwood says, shout there, those shouts are necessary in order for us to be able to hear what people say.
Well, let me put that point then to Ahmed Fawzi. Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi certainly had lots to say when he gave his speech at the UN General Assembly. He went on for more than an hour and a half. But one of the things he ranted about was the UN's power structure and the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. He referred to the UN General Assembly as being the parliament of the world, and that body should be dictating decisions to the Security Council. We've been hearing a lot of talk about engagement and cooperation. Is the General Assembly in some ways more representative of the international community as a whole?
Very interesting indeed. Of course, President Gaddafi delivered a very interesting speech, to say the least, reminiscent of the long speeches of President Castro in the old days when he would speak for over 4 hours. But there were parts of the speech, of course, that raised a lot of question marks. His references to the Charter, for example, and the fact that it wasn't relevant any longer. I think that everybody will agree that the Charter is a perfectly worded document that is still relevant in this day and age. However, having said that, I agree entirely with what Colonel Gaddafi has said about the Security Council and what my colleague on the air, Mr. Tandon, has said as well about the Security Council not being representative of this day and age. And I think a lot of member states will agree that the geopolitical parameters of 1945 no longer exist, and that the Security Council needs to be reformed and expanded to include many other countries that have emerged as economic and political powerhouses over the past 60 years. In fact, there is what they call an open-ended committee, and some joke about it and call it the never-ending committee on reform of the Security Council. But over the past 10 years, there have been discussions in these committees about exactly how to expand the membership of the Security Council. It's not an easy matter because simply those that wield the veto in the Security Council, the 5 permanent members, Russia, China, the UK, France and the United States, refuse to give up their vetoes. And it will take a lot of wrangling,
is that kind of
arguing,
wide-ranging, sorry to interrupt you, but is that multilateral, wide-ranging approach necessarily
Correct.
the right one in terms of the effective running of the UN? Let me put some of what you say to Professor Ruth Wedgwood. In his first address to the UN General Assembly, Barack Obama set a very conciliatory tone, moving away from the kind of unilateralism that we saw under his predecessor, President Bush. He's spoken very much about fostering international cooperation. Is that easier said than done?
Well, it always is. Whatever the size of the Security Council, you'll have major powers that don't agree. The fact that something is a common problem doesn't mean that countries will agree on how to approach it. So that whether it's economic sanctions trying to coerce a country to give up weapons of mass destruction, or it's a proposed intervention with robust peacekeeping, you'll often discover that if you don't have the so-called permanent five on board, you can't do very much. But that said, I'm having a Yogi Berra moment, the old baseball player who was famous for his phrase that it's déjà vu all over again. Because all during the 90s, there was a also never-ending conversation on expanding the council. And ultimately, in 1997, when the General Assembly was chaired by a very capable person named Ismail Razali from Malaysia, it was concluded that the reform couldn't be made because countries wouldn't agree on who was number one or number two or number three in each region, so that the attempt to have a new permanent seat for Africa or Latin America or Asia put all the regional rivals at each other's throat. And that's how it came to persist, if you will, as the council as we know it, which is made up of countries which, for the most part, have the greatest military capability.
Let me get your view on this. In 2005, the then Secretary General Kofi Annan criticized the Assembly for focusing too much on consensus and passing resolutions that reflected, quote, the lowest common denominator of opinions. Do you agree?
Well, I do not agree. I think there are, in fact, I think we tend to focus too much on the Security Council. There are really two major issues that are not seriously institutionally addressed in the UN. The first issue is the governance of the economic institutions, the global economic institutions, the World Bank and the IMF. These are within the Charter described as UN bodies, but they really act autonomously outside the control of the UN. They should be brought within the control of the UN. Secondly, there is a serious gap. There is no real institutional mechanism with the UN to coordinate development policy issues. These are two major issues that confront our world. The financial crisis, because of the lack of policy on the part of World Bank, the IMF, that are pro-developmental, and secondly, lack of development institutions. So no, I don't agree that General Assembly is simply a mouthpiece for irresponsible statements. The statements are reflections of democratic voice of the people who feel that their concerns are not seriously addressed by big powers.
But I mean, how much do they actually achieve? Ahmed Fauzi, does the multilateral approach deliver results? Because progress on containing Iran's nuclear program, on bringing stability in Darfur, on reaching a major climate change agreement, all this has been somewhat elusive.
No, I agree with Dr. Tandon. I believe that the General Assembly is a very serious and relevant body. Multilateralism does work, and this is there is evidence of that in many of the problems that the world faces, whether it's disease or poverty. On the issue of development, I take issue with Dr. Tandon because I do believe there are structures within the United Nations system led by the UN Development Programme to pursue sustainable development and to achieve what we have become known as the Millennium Development Goals, which, as Dr. Tandon knows, includes sustainable development, the elimination of poverty, disease, gender equality, and many of those goals that have to be achieved by 2015. But if I could just say something on the whole relevance of this institution as such, what could be more relevant than three days this week during which over 100 members, heads of state converged onto the United Nations to discuss the very important issue of climate change. More than 63 countries participated in that summit, high-level summit that the Secretary General convened on Tuesday. On Wednesday, of course, you all saw the plenary this morning, a very important issue of disarmament and nuclear non-proliferation, a Security Council summit at head of state level being held to discuss nuclear disarmament. This morning,
let me ask you this.
CTBT,
when we talk about the need for reform within the UN General Assembly, should its powers be strengthened in relation to those of the United Nations Security Council?
You know, that's a question for member states to answer. As a civil servant, I can't answer that. I can tell you that the Secretary General believes that the Security Council should be more representative. One. Two, the General Assembly should play a more effective role in multilateral diplomacy and international affairs. And we were at a meeting with the new president of the General Assembly, and he himself said he was hoping that the General Assembly under his presidency would play a greater role.
Let me ask Yash Tandon then to comment on that. How could the UN General Assembly enhance its role to make itself more effective?
Well, effectiveness lies in the hands of the member states who provide resources to the UN. Ahmad Fauzi rightly mentions that UNDP is an agency for development. I agree. But we have to put to question the conceptual basis of development of the UNDP. It's a conceptual problem of development that we have to address seriously. And I think the General Assembly, for example, the last president of the General Assembly set up a special commission to look at the financial crisis. That, I think, is a very courageous move, because that commission that is set up under Stiglitz was able to put to question the entire conceptual understanding of development and of financial crisis. So here is a General Assembly that need not necessarily put teeth to the resolutions.
But Ruth Wedgwood, the UN Security Council is really the key body within the UN. It's charged with overseeing peace and security in the world, and yet all the decisions and resolutions are determined by the will of 5 countries. Is this structure dynamic enough for the future?
Well, first of all, I would differ with your characterization, because although you have to have the so-called permanent 5 either voting in favor or abstaining, you also need 4 additional countries who are representative of their regional groups to go along with you. So it's not a World War II or aristocracy of just the victors. The problem with the General Assembly is, in my mind, that it votes in blocks, that just as George Washington didn't anticipate political parties, so too here I think there was no anticipation that the G77, which is really a group of 132 countries, it's more than 2/3 of the General Assembly, and therefore can pass resolutions on its own, would have such party discipline. It's very disappointing not to be able to even attend the meetings, the private caucus meetings, which determine the outcome of GA votes. So I think one of the disappointments is that. The second is that, of course, many countries in the UN aren't democratic. So when you talk about democracy in the world, you're talking about the representation of, oftentimes, of non-democratic governments. And the theme that there should be underlying democracy in UN members is one that should not be abandoned by our president or by anybody else. As to the competences, the GA is very important in issues like human rights, in terrorism. I wish that their conversation was, again, freer, so that countries didn't feel that they had to constrain themselves to please the caucus agents, whether it's Egypt or Cuba. It's like Chicago politics or New York politics. You have to go to your clubhouse for all the favors you might want, and that means that small countries that have dissident views can't speak.
Do you agree that there is an inequality within the UN Security Council where you have these 5 countries which wield a veto power? Does it need to be expanded a little more to reflect the world's population?
I think nobody will really differ with that. I actually said that myself earlier in this interview, that we all agree that the Security Council needs to be expanded to properly reflect the geopolitical balance and economic balance in the world today.
Yash Tandon, what's your view on that? Because some would argue that if you did have all 15 members of the Security Council and indeed 192 members of the General Assembly wanting to put their 2 cents in, well, that nothing would ever happen, nothing would ever get done.
Well, let's agree that in fact the Security Council no longer reflects the power or demographic reality of the present world. What do we do now? I think we got to work with what we have, and therefore there are practical ways of going around this issue. One is something that the Western countries did in 1950, when the Soviet veto precluded action in Korea. What they did was to pass a resolution called Uniting for Peace Resolution, that took the Korean matter to the General Assembly. Resolutions were passed and were carried out. So there is a practical way in which in 1950 we were able to get out of the veto power. Same thing can be done again. There are issues on Palestine, on issues regarding conflicts in Africa that do not necessarily get a proper treatment in the Security Council because of the veto. They can be taken to the General Assembly. Then when it's taken to General Assembly, we can work out ways in which we can implement those decisions. In my view, security matters are primarily the concern of nations and regions within the country. So United Nations can play a supporting role. So, for example, in Darfur, in Africa, the AU, African Union, takes the primary responsibility, and United Nations provides supporting materials and so on. So let's not get too much hung up about the Security Council being the only way in which we can bring about security in global organization.
Ahmed Fawzi, let me put this point to you. Is it possible for member states to put their own national interests to one side to address threats to international peace and security?
Not always. As we have seen in the invasion of Iraq in 2003, some member states take matters into their own hands if they don't, at that time, have the agreement of all the membership of the United Nations. But I think that was an exception. What we try to achieve here at the United Nations is consensus on the way forward, whether it's peace and security or multilateral development.
Isn't that consensus precisely the impediment to actual progress, achieving progress on those issues?
Well, I don't entirely agree, because the idea of achieving consensus is to achieve consensus to move forward. You know, at the end of the day, I must also say, having said that, at the end of the day, member states vote at the United Nations according to their national interests. The Security Council is a political body at the end of the day, a body composed of governments, and governments have national interests. What we hope happens in the majority of cases is that they set their national interests aside in favor of international goals and objectives.
OK, well, let me quickly get some final thoughts from you, Ruth Wedgwood. Former US Ambassador to the United Nations John Bolton said if the UN headquarters building in New York lost 10 floors, nobody would notice. What's your view on that? Do you think anyone would notice if the UN disappeared tomorrow?
Well, sometimes John puts things a bit more pungently than others might. It is true, though, that there is a sense of demoralization in the staff of the UN. If you send your young students to work there, you have to warn them that by about age 35, 40, they're going to be feeling quite trapped because of the way in which there's micromanagement of the running of the institution in the hands of the General Assembly, which makes it very difficult for Secretaries General to carry out reforms, because there's often a certain desultory buck slip, for your comment, view that viewing the passing scene is sufficient rather than, as you say, taking action. So it's an organization which is very frustrating to people who work inside, who enter it with the highest expectations, with moral commitment, and often find that in instances like Bosnia, in Rwanda and Sudan, the UN does much too little.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Ruth Wedgwood in Washington, D.C., Yash Tandon in Geneva, and also Ahmed Fawzi in New York. Appreciate your thoughts on this. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We, of course, welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.